Up, everyone? Happy Wednesday to you. Hope everyone is doing well out there. It's finally here, man. Prime time is nearly upon us. I'm pretty pumped up for my rutcation. I have almost 2 full weeks off from work to hunt, so I'm pretty fired up about that. My plans really, I think I'd mentioned this earlier on some podcasts that maybe John and I did when we were covering what our plans were for the year, but I'm going to be headed back probably to my dad's property to hunt for a couple days, so that'll probably be I guess it'll be the 30th, 31st, the 1st, and then probably the morning of the 2nd. And then the afternoon of the 2nd, I'll be driving to Ohio, then to round out the rest of my rut vacation. So I'll be hunting really the 3rd, or if I can get out there early enough, maybe go hunt the evening of the 2nd, but at least the 3rd through likely the 11th, I guess is what the plan will be. Not saying that, maybe I don't tag out here in Pennsylvania prior to that, still have a hunt this upcoming weekend. It looks like the weather's going to be good. It looks like I'm going to have the wind that I need to hunt a couple deer that I've been after. So maybe we'll get it done there. If that's the case, then I'll shift gears and kind of call an audible and head to Ohio early, which wouldn't be a terrible thing because there's really a couple other places I'd like to scout out that I didn't get a chance to really kind of fully cover, this past summer, whenever I was out, past summer and fall when I was out there doing my camera hanging and scouting for this upcoming year. So those are my plans for the year. And just, as fate would have it, and it wasn't really done on purpose necessarily, but this podcast is the final part number 3 of the DIY Report miniseries with Dr. Bronson Strickland, where we're talking about deer movement. In the first couple episodes, we talked about deer movement on a herd level, and then we talked about deer movement, on a singular kind of like, individual deer level or buck movement, maybe might be a better way to put it. And so this one is kind of timed up perfectly, where today we're really talking about the rut and why the rut occurs and what creates the movement and what creates all the scenes that we've kind of see during that, brief window period of, going from pre-rut to lockdown, and then what happens potentially afterwards as well. So that is what the plan is for today. I think, as I'd mentioned, this is perfectly timed as we're getting ready to kind of move into this part of the season. And it kind of gives us all maybe a little brush up on our bag of tricks before we hit the timber during the prime time, the time of year that we all kind of wait for. So one more bit of housekeeping I want to do here before we get ready to jump into the podcast is to make a mention of, during the course of my 2-week-ish rutcation, I'll actually be hunting with Chad Sylvester of Exodus Outdoor Gear. And the plan is, and I'm mentioning it here on the podcast to have some public peer pressure, is the plan is to record a podcast every day in the evening after each hunt to kind of bring you guys along, so you can follow along with how the hunt is kind of unfolding and what's happening each day. So I'm making that statement now, and hopefully I'm able to hold myself to it. I just think it would be kind of neat to kind of bring you guys along with that and share what's happening. I'll probably be doing also some Instagram live things, so if you're not following us on Instagram, go ahead and hit that follow button and follow along there as well. With that, we'll go ahead and take a quick second to talk about our partners who continue to help us make this podcast possible, and then we will roll right into talking with Dr. Bronson Strickland. First and foremost, we are brought to you by Wicked Tree Gear, the longest lasting, fastest cutting, toughest tree trimming equipment you have ever used. Simply put, the toughest saws on earth. How tough are they? Tough enough to come with a lifetime warranty. And right now, when you visit wickedtreegear.com, use the promo code TRUTH at checkout and get a 20% discount on your Wicked purchase. We are also brought to you by Exodus Outdoor Gear. The Trek camera comes in at $145. It has the same proprietary shell design as the Lift Series camera, same 5-year warranty and unmatched customer service policies, a 0.7 second trigger speed, photo, video, time lapse, and hybrid modes, all with a simple single line backlit LED display. You also get about 20,000 images on one set of lithium batteries. And if you'd like to learn more about Exodus trail cameras, head over to ExodusOutdoorGear.com and check them out. And if you like what you see, use the promo code TRUTH at checkout and save yourself $20 on a new camera. We're also brought to you by Glacier Coolers, simply the world's finest. Whether you're hunting, camping, or fishing, you'll enjoy smarter design, stronger construction, and superior insulation of Glacier Coolers. Visit them at glaciercoolers.com. Use promo code TRUTH at checkout and save yourself 20%. And now, without further ado, let's go ahead and get Dr. Bronson Strickland on the line to talk the why behind the rut. All right, folks, welcome back. You are listening to another episode of the Truth from the Stand Deer Hunting Podcast. This is the DIY Report mini-series. We are talking still deer movement. We're going to shift gears just a little bit here for part number 3, and we're going to talk more about the why behind the rut. We will still talk a little bit about movement, but we're going to kind of get into movement under the kind of understanding or the perspective or the lens, maybe I should say, of the rut. But before we jump into that, I'm, of course, joined by my guest, Dr. Bronson Strickland. How's it going, buddy?
It's going great. Thanks again for having me. I look forward to talking about the rut.
Yeah, man, I've enjoyed our conversations. I'm a self-proclaimed deer nerd and deer geek, so all the stuff that we've been talking about has been tickling my fancy, shall we say. So I'm really looking forward to this topic of conversation.
Welcome to the club, being a deer geek. I'm a card-carrying member.
Nice. I'm glad that you're allowing me into the club. It might be the only club that I'm a part of, or that my wife will allow me into now, post my band and rock and roll days. Yeah. But with that, let's go ahead and jump into the rut. So this is the sexy time of year that all hunters kind of dream about. We spend all season kind of planning for it. We take vacation for it. I take vacation for it, right? So my big question to you, and this is, both as like a biologist, a researcher, but also as a deer hunter. So why do you think the rut is such a big deal for hunters? I mean, I have a perspective, but I want to get a perspective for you, why you think it's such a big deal for hunters. Specifically, if we as hunters and hardcore deer hunters are really trying to understand deer and bucks specifically, their behavior, how they're using habitat, how they're using terrain features and stuff like that, the rut seems like the absolute worst part of the year to try to enact on, or enact a plan based on anything that we've learned about them throughout the course of a year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, however long you're watching specific deer herds and so forth. So what is it about the rut that makes us kind of throw away all the stuff that we've learned for this one period during the course of the season?
It's a free-for-all that provides opportunity,
right?
Is the way I like to think about it. So all the scouting, and patterning bucks and, their daily ritual and the diurnal patterns of when they're moving and where, you can just throw all that out the window. But because now, the buck has completely shifted. He has a one-track mind. He is totally focused on locating females that are coming into estrus. Literally kind of throws caution to the wind. And that's why, we see so much more daytime activity. So when I was saying opportunity, if you're lucky enough to be there on that magic day or days, you'll see deer activity all day long. And that buck that may not have been exposing himself during daylight hours, now he's out and about, and now he's susceptible to hunter harvest. Right. So I think generally it provides opportunity, and also it provides for a real fun hunt. At least it does in my case.
Yeah, exactly. I think the way I kind of look at it is very similar. I look at it as the rut is kind of like the Buffalo Bills preseason. It's the time in which you have hope. That might have been a little cruel since they got smoked in the first game of their year, but it's I think, and I'm the same way. I take time off during the rut because everyone who listens to this podcast knows I'm a normal working guy. I work a normal job. Love doing the podcast, but my full-time job is in marketing and advertising, and so I spend a lot of time looking at, topo maps and trying to understand what deer are doing and stuff like that. But really, when it comes down to it, to really kind of get the job done, I have a very, small window of opportunity because I can't kind of watch the weather and hunt like the best days. I got to hunt whenever I am able to get out and hunt. So the rut for me kind of provides me that opportunity where if I don't get something done earlier in the season when I'm kind of picking and choosing my days, the rut is the best opportunity for me to kind of have use a little bit of experience and skill coupled with a little bit of luck. You know what I mean?
That's right. That
can create some magic. And that's kind of how I look at it. Now, I've grown more and more fond of hunting outside of the rut. And oddly enough, one of my favorite times of the year is actually hunting late season. Because, even though deer are a little bit more skittish in PA, all the fair weather hunters are typically out of the woods during that time of the year because the weather gets rough and stuff like that. And so you have a little bit more free reign over property, so you can really start to use what you know about the deer during that time of year. But So the net is, I agree with you, and I'm sorry to Buffalo Bills fans out there that I bashed you right there. But so I'm curious, about this next question. So what is the biology of the rut? So what is it that drives the rut in overall, and what is taking place? Changes in deer activity and level of movement during this particular time period.
Okay, during this time of year, bucks and does are completely different physiologically, or at least in how they're responding. So, when a buck loses his velvet, when he's in full hard antler, he is physiologically capable to breed. So even though the rut is nowhere near, once he is in hard antler, he is physiologically capable to breed. The problem is that there's a mismatch between when a buck is capable to breed and when the female is breeding. Mm-hmm. And so typically the buck is ready. He's been in hard antler. They've established their dominance hierarchies. There's been all sorts of fighting, and they figured out, all the different social scheme of who's dominant. And then it's simply waiting for does to come into estrus. So the same mechanism, photoperiod, that triggers the increase in testosterone production is also going to be what stimulates a doe to come into estrus.
So I'm curious how long. So when we see chasing activity and stuff like that, how long prior or before breeding will a doe start to give off like her what I'll call is her vibe, her barroom vibe, if you will?
Her perfume.
Yeah, exactly. How long before breeding does that happen? Like, when can you start to really anticipate that true, pre-estrus, I guess, seeking and chasing?
We generally think of there's about 3 days in there. There's going to be, let's start with the event.
Okay.
All this is going to build up into a 6 to 12 hour time, kind of in that time frame, where we say the doe is in standing heat, meaning she is receptive to a buck to breed. Mm-hmm. Prior to that, though, when you see all this chasing going on, that basically the female has given off a pheromone or a smell that's saying it's getting close. Right. I am coming into standing heat, and that may be a period of 12 hours to 24 hours before she comes into standing heat. Mm-hmm. And so that is when you'll see, and this will depend on your buck to doe ratio and deer density and all that. But if you're hunting a wide open space, like when I was in South Texas, it wasn't uncommon at all to have a doe that was nearing standing heat to have 7 different bucks chasing behind her. So that depends, of course, also on how many does in the population are simultaneously coming into heat, and that peak of when the most does are in heat at the same time, which is typically going to be about over a 2-week period. That is what we call the peak of the rut.
Right. And so how long will a doe stay in standing estrus?
It's probably over within 12 hours, and probably most of that is taking place within 6 hours and sometimes less. So it's a real defined period of time of when she's receptive, and the buck wants to be there when that occurs.
Right. And I know that this is probably, dependent upon, ratios and so on and so forth, but what percentage in generalities here of does are bred on that first cycle?
Probably 95+%.
Wow.
Maybe more like 98%. Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
So what happened generations ago? So let's back up 20 or 30 years. Mm-hmm. If you look at some of our herds, by the time rut came around, you may have a very, very skewed sex ratio, meaning you may have 5, 6, 7, 8 does for every adult buck when the rut comes around. When that is the case, sometimes when does are coming into heat simultaneously, there aren't enough bucks in the population to breed all of the does while they are in standing heat. And so, you'll hear people from years ago talk about the second rut,
Mm-hmm.
or a rut lasting for 3 months, seeing breeding activity for 3 months. Well, if a herd is managed or a herd is natural, where sex ratios are close to even, that is just not going to occur. And typically, Clint, now when we start seeing rutting behavior, breeding behavior, like a month after the peak, often that is fawns that are coming into heat for the first time.
Right.
And depending on where you're at in the country, and I know this firsthand from one of my old roommates, was a biologist in Iowa. You can have some regions in Iowa that 70% of the fawns will come into estrus. If you're in Mississippi, the most we have ever seen in a year in a population would be 15%.
Wow.
So usually you're going to have that first big, the big breeding season that'll typically take place over 2 to 3 weeks. That's probably going to get 80 to 90% of the breeding events, taking place over that 3-week period. And then a month later, you'll see a couple more little bumps, a little more activity. Often that is fawns. Mm-hmm. But in the old days, that month later rut occurring was because some adult does didn't get bred simply because there weren't enough bucks in the population.
Right. And I just want to jump to that secondary rut right there. And so that, correct me if I'm wrong here, but that is really also a reason why you might be seeing it in places like Iowa versus not happening necessarily in Mississippi and so forth, is that those fawns, those doe fawns, really have to hit certain biomarkers or mass, right, in order for, or weight rather, in order for their body to kind of cue them biologically that they're able to have offspring. Is that correct?
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. So that is a combination of how much time did you have to grow before the rut occurred, and then how much food was available to you. Mm-hmm. So if you're hitting the ground in May in Iowa and you have soybeans to eat all summer, mm-hmm. There's a great likelihood that you're going to reach that critical body mass that would then stimulate, reproduction. Mm-hmm. But if you're in another place, the further you move south, where those fawning dates may be July, August, and sometimes September, you just simply don't have enough time to grow large enough when the rut happens,
right,
for them to come into heat. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So I want to shift gears here and talk about something that I think hunters kind of bat around a lot, and that is the timing of the rut, right? You will hear folks talk about, oh, the rut was late this year. It didn't happen till whatever the dates are, right? Like you'll hear about it being a moving target, right? This year, the rut dates were, the 6th through the 10th or whatever. And then the next year it'll be like, well, I didn't see any rut activity until the 15th or the, whatever it is, the 18th, whatever the case might be. So, and I think, for the most part, like what I kind of picked up from, what you were just kind of mentioning, there's an envelope with, that this happens in, right? So I guess let's start here. Let's unpack it this way. So does the rut, let's, I guess, put to bed for once and for all, it happens consistently the same time of year for specific regions, year over year over year. Is that correct?
Before we continue our conversation, let's talk about Wicked Tree Gear saws. Hardcore deer hunters need hardcore tools. Do yourself a favor and check out Wicked Tree Gear, the toughest hand saws and pull saws on earth. You buy it once, you buy it for life, backed by a lifetime guarantee. Right now, if you use the promo code TRUTH, you'll save 20% on your next purchase with free ground shipping. So head over to wickedtreegear.com and get a saw that's tough enough to work as hard as you hunt.
That is correct. And the way that we can definitively show that, Clint, is that your state wildlife agency, they do it in Mississippi, I'm sure they do it in Pennsylvania, where the rubber meets the road, where when you know that the rut is occurring the same time every year, is when a state wildlife agency does what's called a herd health assessment, or at least that's what we call it in Mississippi. Mm-hmm. And during the springtime, they will go out populations all over the state, and they will randomly select does for harvest. And what they're doing with that is they are assessing productivity. And so they'll harvest that doe in the springtime. We'll do a necropsy on her, and we'll be able to look at her body fat, her kidney fat, her body mass. How does she look physically? And then also we're going to see how many fetuses does she have in utero. So that's the productivity part. Now, aside from that, is we can get those fetuses and backdate them based on the size. We have a very, very accurate formula. We can look at what is today's date when the doe was harvested, what is the size of the fetus she is carrying, and we know within a give or take a day when she was bred.
Wow.
And when you do that from place to place, year to year, after year after year, we see that if 10 years ago the peak of the rut was December 1st, then this year the peak of the rut is going to be December 1st.
Right.
Now, sure, based on random sampling, because you're not sampling every doe, you're only sampling a few of them. Oh, the peak from your sample, it may be the 3rd or it may be the 1st, but the bottom line, you never ever see these 3-week shifts or 2-week shifts in the rut, and that's based on the very best data, the fetus.
Right.
We know when the fetus was conceived.
So populations are breeding consistently from year to year, but are there any factors that would delay the timing of does or a single doe coming into estrus that might be environmental, whether it's like some type of environmental stress, lack of food? Is there anything that could create a delay by any, measurable amount?
It can happen, but it rarely does. And so I think of this in 3 stages. The rut or the breeding date for that female is genetically determined. It is stimulated by photoperiod, and then sometimes affected by her physical condition. And really what we see, probably the only thing of any significance would just be if she's in a really, really poor body condition, then she may not be ovulating with the regularity that she has in previous years. But most often, again, looking at a population scale, most of those does are in good condition. And photoperiod's not changing, her genes aren't changing. And so unless she's in a really bad condition or some circumstance like that, she's probably going to breed about at the exact same time every year.
Right. And it's interesting. Like it's just nice or cool to get like the confirmation, just because I have a spot that I like to hunt, and I've hunted in the past, and I had a buddy hunt it. And, I'm sure the folks who listen to this podcast heard me talk about this before, but so we've hunted it. I've hunted it one year, killed a nice deer. My buddy hunted it last year when I wasn't at this place in my stead, and saw the same exact thing that I saw the year before when I killed my deer. And it was during the same handful of days. Like it was like a 3 to 4 day window that there were just bucks chasing, grunting, fighting, sparring, like just the type of stuff you see on TV. You know what I mean? Like it happens in this one area, and it's happened consistently now 2 years in a row. And so to me, like if I ever needed real world kind of proof that I visibly saw that like this stuff happens at the same time within like herds in the same places, like that was it. Because it seems like it's consistently happening every year around the same 3 day window, that it goes bananas, and it's like, and really what it is, there ends up being a hot doe in there every year at that time, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
In that area, because there's a doe bedding area there. So, but you'd mentioned genetically passing those breeding dates. So what I'm hearing you say is that a doe does in fact pass her estrus dates to her doe fawns. So those fawns, if she comes in on the, let's call it the 6th of November, right? Or 7th of November, whatever it is. And she has doe fawns. Those doe fawns are going to come in on the 6th of November as well. Is that right?
That's right. Give or take on the average, but yeah, that's exactly right. And that's the reason that in the southeastern U.S. you see from county to county. I mean, literally, we have some places in Mississippi that from one county to the next, you might have almost a month difference in the rut. And that is basically from restocking. So deer are being brought from all over the country when the restocking in Mississippi and a lot of places in the South, occurred in the 50s and 60s and some in the 70s. But that is an inheritance.
Mm-hmm.
So they inherit that, and their fawns inherited, and their fawns inherited, and that is why you will see such a distinct difference, is because the pedigree, so to speak, of the population from that next county over probably was different. And we actually, Steve Damaris, my co-director in the deer lab here, they did some genetic research that demonstrated this very, very clearly.
So I know that, when we talk about rut and breeding, like this is all kind of photo period is in play here. And then there's also the aspect of evolution, I guess is what I'm trying to say, is in play, where the deer have to drop their fawns by a certain time so they have an opportunity to grow and, be strong enough to withstand the weather that's approaching. And correct me if I'm wrong, but that's, in layman's terms, it's kind of, the outline of it. Is there, what about in places, because obviously for people who are listening, like that's, winter is coming, it's going to get harsh, food is going to get scarce. So these deer need to be able to be strong enough to weather those harsh conditions. So when we get into places like Florida, which has abundant food year round, and there really isn't such a thing as a winter necessarily, how does that impact when they're going to drop fawns based on their survival capability to survive?
Well, for example, in some places in South Florida, the rut may be in July. Here's what happens, Clint, when you move, a very general relationship here. When you move from a temperate area in North America, so let's say Pennsylvania and even further north, the closer and closer you move to the equator, when you get into a tropical environment, which basically, like you said, is the same year round, we see a decrease in the consistency of conception dates at a population scale. So if you look at deer species in Central America, South America, close to the equator, rut occurs year-round. There is no single established rut period. Breeding season happens year-round because there is no environmental selective force to push them one way or the other.
Right.
Resources are the same year-round. If you contrast that with Manitoba or something like that, there's a very defined period of time where that fawn has got to hit the ground early enough, but not too early. Fawn can't be dropped before winter's over.
Right.
You got to hit right when spring green up is coming, grow as fast as you can, achieve the appropriate body mass and fat levels, and if you don't, it's death.
Right.
And so that is Mother Nature's most harsh selective force. There is you'll die.
Right.
And so that pattern easily becomes entrenched. If something's genetically controlled and then reinforced by an environmental pressure, it becomes a very reliable pattern.
Right. Yeah, that's some harsh punishment for deer, right? It's like wrong birth date, you're out of gas.
Sorry, pal.
Yeah.
No second chances.
No. So just a couple more here that I have that I want to cover before I let you go. But so you had mentioned sex ratios a little earlier, and so I want to just understand how sex ratios impact the rut overall, because you'll hear hunters, especially folks who are managing land, like might say, we've got to harvest some does this year, and part of that might be because they're looking at the balance of their habitat and what it can support, right? That's one aspect of doe management, and harvesting. But then there's the other aspect where you hear folks talk about, like, I need to control the ratios. So what does sex ratio, having a balanced versus an unbalanced sex ratio during the rut, have in terms of kind of determining the activity, movement, and just overall kind of health of the rut?
Okay, so think of it this way. A skewed sex ratio, in this case, if we had 5 does to 1 buck or 7 does to 1 buck, it's not going to affect the timing of the rut when it begins. What it will affect is the duration of the rut, meaning that, as we touched on earlier, is that, again, genetically controlled, stimulated by photoperiod, and okay, here the hormone surges begin, and this doe is in heat. She's in standing heat. Mm-hmm. But simultaneously, all around her, there may be 10 other does that are in standing heat, but there's only 2 bucks. Mm-hmm. So physically, they are not physically capable of breeding with all those does while they are in standing estrus. And what the doe will do is recycle. If she did not conceive during that first copulation event, then what she's going to do is recycle, very similar time scale to humans, 28 days later, then she's going to come into heat again. And so now, since some of those does did get bred, now there's fewer does in estrus at any given time, and then they're probably going to be bred on the second time. Some interesting factoids here. In research pens, then it's been demonstrated that they will cycle up to 5 or 6 times before their body just finally says, all right, it's not happening this year.
Right.
And they'll stop cycling. Another interesting thing that happens, it was something we actually documented here at Mississippi State about a decade ago, is that 25% of twin litters were fathered by different bucks. So
that's interesting.
So the term is multiple paternity. So while she was in standing heat, one buck may have bred and put his nose in the air, and there's another doe coming into heat, and he runs off and starts chasing her, and then another buck, she's still receptive, and then another buck will breed her. But yeah, about 25% of the time when a doe produces 2 fawns, they're going to have a different father.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
So I'm always curious. So this is something that I read, and had a fella on who had kind of mentioned this in terms of hunting and how he kind of approaches the rut. And I thought it was kind of interesting. And in theory, it sounds right. And I just want to get your perspective on it from a science kind of perspective. So if you're on a farm and it's a farm anywhere USA, and you're hunting the rut, and you're trying to determine your stand locations based on that, that a buck is going to be checking doe bedding because your property comes in during this week or whatever, usually when you start to see your activity pick up. What this gentleman kind of suggested was, and I kind of thought it made sense, was that when you're trying to pick where you're going to put your stand, so if you have doe bedding areas A, B, and C, and they're in order of dominance, right? A is the most dominant, B is the secondary, and C is the tertiary doe group. The dominant doe group is the doe group that you want to hunt early in rut, because they're likely going to have dominated the best bedding and the best food source. Therefore, their bodies should be in the best shape and functioning as it should, which means their estrus cycle should come in as genetically predisposed to do so. Mm-hmm. And then at the same time, once that doe group starts to go out, you start seeing less activity, you kind of transition to hunt that second doe group, and then to that third doe group to kind of follow the bucks to the different doe groups that are going to be coming in. Now, this cycle might happen, based on what we've been talking about, within a very small window of time, be it a handful of days. Mm-hmm. But what do you think of that? Is that something that's plausible or not? Or what are your thoughts?
I could see where there's some merit to that. Mm-hmm. I guess the issues I would have is, how am I as a hunter going to determine which of the doe groups is more dominant? Mm-hmm. Who's number 1, who's number 2, who's number 3? And along with that, let's say that group A is the dominant matriarch. Mm-hmm. She's the oldest, she's the biggest, she is socially, she's the stuff. That is not correlated to when genetically she may be predisposed to come into estrus. So even though physiologically she's in fantastic shape, which means that when by a photoperiod in her genetics, she comes into estrus ASAP, but it doesn't mean that a more subordinate doe, she may be genetically programmed to come into heat 5 days earlier.
Right, and what she has in terms of habitat and food sources available to her may be adequate for her to hit that.
Yeah, right. Absolutely.
Science, man. I love it.
Well, that's just my 2 cents. That's the way I would look at it.
Right. No, it's just, just science. It's like it provides you a platform to kind of decouple things is what I love about it. You know what I mean? It gives you a set of, and a perspective and a way of thinking to kind of solve problems, and then also kind of pick things apart to make sure that they stand up to the rigor. You know, it's a fascinating field, science in general, especially for us deer hunters. The biology of deer is, exponentially, more fascinating than any other type of science I think that we probably engage with. But so one last question before I let you go.
Let me give you 2 more cents on that, where I thought you were going. And
Yeah.
I was thinking, well, absolutely, that's what I would do. So if I had knowledge of that this doe group hangs out over here, this doe group hangs out over here, I mean, what I'm going to do is I'm going to look for some type of cover corridor that links the two.
Mm-hmm.
Because we know, as we talked about previously, bucks are going to be checking those, and they're probably not going to do it in a willy-nilly fashion.
Yeah.
They're probably going to follow a pretty much similar corridor to and from. And if you can find a network, of corridors connecting those, I think that would be a very high probability place to set up and see a buck.
Right, because as we were talking in part 2, it's like they have a rhyme to a reason as to how they check their specific areas, and they have timing that they will kind of adhere to a degree, in which they want to, how often they want to get back to these places. That's another good point. So one last thing before I let you go. We always hear about a lot of folks, I think, when they see deer chasing, right? It's a buck chasing a doe because he's trying to, she's giving off her perfume and he's saying, hey, you're close, I'm going to hang out with you. Maybe he acts like a gentleman early because he knows it's not maybe prime time yet, but as things get closer, he becomes a little bit more pushy and so forth. So the conventional kind of thinking is that, the buck is choosing the doe or carving her out to breed. So who is doing the choosing here? Is the doe doing the selecting, or is the buck selecting the doe for breeding?
Man, that is a great question. It is something we have wrestled with. And I don't know if you might be referring to some research that we just concluded, where we engage in this topic called female choice.
Yeah, I may have wittingly placed this.
Okay. Well, let me give people just a little bit of background. I promise I won't ramble too long. So, in the most of the animal world, think specifically like people have watched any type of nature show. They have seen bird behavior, where the male is going to think turkeys. The male is going to strut and display. Think of a peacock's tail. Think of the birds of paradise, where literally you have this female sitting there scrutinizing and picking which male she thinks is going to be the best father. Now, why does she care so much? Is because it's her investment. She is the one that is going to grow these deer or grow these eggs. She is the one that's going to sit on the nest. And incubate. So it comes at a tremendous cost to her to do that. So think of a doe. So now we're in the deer world. Man, that buck, he's in it for a couple days and he's gone.
Right.
The other 363 days a year, he doesn't have anything to do with that doe. He's not going to have anything to do with that fawn. So she has all the reason in the world to pick the right father.
Right.
So we had always talked about female choice has to be at some level working with whitetail deer. So we conducted an experiment where we manipulated antlers. We had does that were in estrus. They were chemically induced to be in estrus. And with various techniques, we assessed with a very high rate of probability that most often if a doe is given a choice, of the same age buck, the same body size. The only thing that is different is their antler size. She chooses the buck with large antlers. Why would she do that? Well, antlers are a signal. They're a signal of genetic quality. They're a signal of I know how to navigate the landscape and acquire food. So we look at antlers as they're also an ornament. They're a weapon for combat,
Right.
but they're also an ornament to a female to display genetic quality. Now, the thing about it, Clint, is does cannot, that's in a pen, that's an experiment. But in the wild, does cannot manipulate which buck breeds with her. She basically, what we call passively, so she's making herself available. She is hoping that the process of male-to-male combat, that the biggest male has won.
Mm-hmm.
That the most fit male has won, and he's going to be the one chasing her, and then he's going to be the one to breed her. But what we're thinking more now, and it's actually tied into these excursions, Clint, what we started wondering is maybe she might be choosing by availing herself at a certain time in a certain area where a certain buck may be.
Right.
Maybe that's her way of facilitating choice in some way. So she's not choosing directly, but she might be increasing the odds of where she goes and hangs out while she's coming into estrus of connecting with that buck that
Right.
she had communicated with earlier.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. That's kind of wild the way that kind of played out in the pen, though. Like that leads you
It
to,
was clear as day. There
Yeah.
was no dispute.
yeah, and it leads you to believe, like to your point, it's like there's a lot of variables when you get into the wild, but it would only make sense that if they are making a choice whenever it's controlled, there has to be some type of effort to persuade or tip the odds. You know what I mean? Because otherwise,
Right.
why would it be hardwired that way? Otherwise.
Yeah, that's what I'd always thought. Is like this just can't be random
Right.
on a mother's, because she has everything to gain by having some participate in some way, of who breeds her.
Right. Well, that I think concludes our part number 3. Dr. Strickland, I just want to say thanks for coming on and doing this session, the 3-part series. I think a lot of folks out there are going to really enjoy kind of hearing the hunter and the kind of science and research aspect of things, and kind of debunking some things that we've probably kind of held on to too long to a degree during our hunting careers. But before I let you go, if you wouldn't mind, just give the people that are listening some information about you and where they might be able to find more about you and the type of work that you guys are doing in your podcast and so forth.
Absolutely. Clint, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity. It's always fun to talk about deer biology and deer management, and I'm happy to do it anytime. A little bit about me and us here at the MSU Deer Lab. A couple places you can find us and connect with us. Of course, you can just go to our website, msudeerlab.com. We're engaged with social media, so we have a Facebook page, Twitter account, Instagram. All that is just MSU Deer Lab. And we post on that regularly. Like when we upload a new podcast episode, we make sure we announce that on our Facebook page. So pretty much if you follow us on social media, you're going to be aware of all the events that are coming around here with us. And if you want to look for more information, like we have a kind of an encyclopedia of deer biology information on our website with a lot of the topics we talked about tonight, go explore our website, and you'll probably find what you're looking for there.
Yeah, folks, be sure to give it a check. The podcast is one of those ones where if you are a deer, just a person who wants as much information about deer as you can possibly get, like there's really no other place to turn to get it. One of my favorite ones is really kind of talking about mineral stumps.
Yes.
And I know that you have a soft spot for mineral stumps, but it's incredibly fascinating. If you're a person who just wants to learn more about deer biology, management, or whatever the case might be, like you've got to check it out. Again, the site is literally an encyclopedia of anything you could possibly want to know about deer. So be sure to give them a follow. I will put all the links to all these different places in the blog post show notes. And with that, Dr. Strickland, thanks so much, and good luck to you this season. And let's be sure to stay in touch.
Absolutely. Call me anytime, Clint. I'm happy to help.
All right, folks, that is a wrap for today's show. I'd like to thank Dr. Strickland for joining us for this entire series. It's been awesome to have him on, learn a ton of stuff, and hopefully you guys have been able to take a few things away from it, away from our recent conversations to help you in the deer woods this year and going forward. Be sure to check out his podcast, Deer University, for more in-depth reviews of the science behind all things whitetail, and follow them on Facebook and Instagram at MSU Deer Lab. We'd, of course, like to thank all of you for listening, and if you haven't yet, please head over to iTunes and leave us a 5-star rating, and be sure to subscribe to the podcast. We'd be super appreciative if you could do those two things for us. And before we shut this thing down, we need to give a big shout out to our partners that continue to help us make this podcast possible. Wicked Tree Gear, Exodus Outdoor Gear, Trophy Ridge, Ozonics, Obsession Bows, Tecumani Seed, Glacier Coolers, Ramcat Broadheads, Trophy Taker Rests, and Dead Downwind. And until next time, we'll see y'all.